morning. I'm Lauren with the Pikes Peak Library District. My pronouns are she and hers, and today I'm going to be showing you how to sew a simple stuffed dragon plushie. Now before we get started, there are a few supplies we need. First of all, we're going to need some kind of fabric to make up the body of our dragon plushie. I am using felt. It can be whatever color combination you like, but you could also use an old t-shirt, an old pillowcase, any kind of fabric that you have lying around will work just fine for this. You're also going to need something you can stuff inside so that it'll be a fluffy stuffed animal. I've got polyfill here, but you could use more fabric, paper, whatever you'd like. Just keep in mind that you're going to need enough of it to make a pretty puffy stuffed animal. So probably about at least 2 handfuls worth. Then you're going to need a needle and thread. Now I'm using embroidery floss here, but you can use just any kind of thread that you have on hand. Nothing specific is needed for this. And of course a needle, I'm using an embroidery needle, but again, no specific kind of needle is needed for this one. It's a pretty simple project we'll be doing today. And then there's some stuff that's optional but really nice to have. So pins like this that you can use to hold your project together before you start sewing. Also a needle threader. It can be kind of a pain to poke thread through the eye of a needle, and this just kind of makes it simpler, but I'll show you how to do it both ways. And it's also really nice if you have it to have chalk so that you can trace your pattern on the fabric, but a Sharpie or a pencil or a pen will work just fine for that as well, and you'll just sew the side with the drawing on it so that the person can't see it, it'll be on the inside. And then the other 2 things that you'll need are a pair of scissors for cutting our fabric and also for cutting our pattern. So I have just kind of drawn my own dragon pattern, so just a blank piece of paper and a pen or pencil to sketch your pattern is really the last thing that you'll need. And then you're ready to jump into it. Okay, so the first thing that you're going to do is just to sketch what you want your dragon to look like. I'm going to go for a really simple cartoonish shape because I don't want to have a lot of edges or parts that are hard to cut out or hard to sew around. And I'm going to aim for about this big in size, right, because I don't want this to be crazy large or to take a ton of time to sew. So I'm just going to go ahead and sketch. And once you've got the rough outline of what you want your dragon to look like, you're just going to go ahead and take your scissors and cut it out. Alright, so I went ahead and I cut out my dragon design, and I've cut out each individual part of the body so that I can trace each one separately onto the felt. It'll make it easier to cut out, and that way if I want to use different colors of felt for the wing versus the body, it's easier, right? So here I've got the main body, kind of snake-like, right? The spikes that I'm going to do along his neck, and the wings. And I'll include a scanned version of this if you want to do the same, but I suspect you're much better at drawing than I am. If you're not better at drawing, but you also don't want to use my snake dragon, what you can do is go online and look for dragon clip art or line art, and you can copy it onto paper or trace it onto paper and use that as your template instead. So you don't need to be a master artist at all to get a basic outline for a stuffed animal like this. Okay, so once you've got your dragon parts cut out on paper, what you're going to do is just copy them onto the fabric you're using. So for me, I'm going to use blue felt for the body. So I'm just going to lay out the blue felt here, lay out my dragon body here, and I'm going to use chalk to trace around it. Now, once you've got your dragon outlined onto the felt, all you have to do is just grab your pair of scissors and cut it out. So let's do that now. Okay, so I've cut out all the parts of my dragon now, and you always need to cut 2 of each piece, right? Because you're sewing the back and the front. So once you've cut one out, you'll just go ahead and trace it again and cut the other out. And same deal, we've got our wings here, and then we've got these little spiky parts that are going to go on the top of his head. And once you're happy with how those look, you can kind of arrange it on top of each other just to get a feel for how it's going to look when it's all together. So I'm just going to go ahead and say this part goes on the top of his head. His wings I'm going to go ahead and poke between his body. And we'll end up with something like this as our basic design, right? And of course it's going to look a little different when we got the eyes and the nose and all the details on there, but that'll be the basic outline of how we want this to look. And if you're not happy with that, you can go back now and you can do some trimming, you can recut, you can try it in different colors. I am happy with this, so I'm just going to move ahead. And the very first thing that I'm going to do actually is just create the design on his face. The reason we're doing the design on his face first is that once we've sewn it together, it'll be really, really hard to get a needle in there to add any details. So while it's still separate, I'm just going to decide that this is his front, and I'm going to go ahead and sew his eye, his eyebrow, and his nostrils on here. So I will show you how to get started with that. Okay, so the very first thing that we need to do before we can start sewing is thread our needle, of course. So I went ahead and I cut off about an arm's length worth of black thread, and this is what I'm going to use for his eyes, eyebrows, and nostril. Of course you can use different colors or whatever you have on hand. Now because I'm using embroidery thread instead of just regular thread, this actually has 5 separate strands in one little piece of thread. Well, that's really too thick, so I'm just going to go ahead and separate out 2 or 3, and that's what I'm going to go ahead and be sewing with. So you just really grab the 2 strands and pull them apart, and I'll set aside the extra for later in case we need it. So I'm going to show you 2 different ways that you can thread the needle. Now, if you have a needle threader like this, there's a really easy way of doing it. Grab your needle threader, poke the needle threader through the eye of the needle, and I'll hold that up real close so you can see. And then you put your thread through the needle threader, which has a much bigger hole in it, right? So that's a lot easier to pull through than just the tiny eye of the needle, and then drag that needle threader backwards. Voila, you have a threaded needle. Pretty simple. But if you don't have a needle threader, as I suspect most people don't, what you're going to do is just poke it straight through the eye yourself. The easiest way to do this, I've found, is first make sure that you've got all of the threads trimmed equally at the end. It'll be really annoying if one piece is longer than the other. And then I just lick it, and I flatten it against my thumb so that all the pieces are sticking together. And then pull it on through. So not too difficult either way. It can be a little annoying depending on the size of the eye of your needle, but try it a couple different ways and see if that works for you. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is to get ready to sew our eye on, right? So before we get started, I'm just going to tie a quick knot at the end of my thread. So why am I doing that? Well, if we don't tie the knot here and we pull through and start sewing the eye, this is just going to be dangling loose, and if we yank too hard, we'll rip out the whole thing we just sewed. So what we do is we tie a knot at the very end of the thread so that it anchors it in place, and we don't have to worry about losing all of our hard work afterwards. And I'm just going to form a little loop-de-loop here and pull the thread through. Just a really simple loop knot. Let me come up a little closer to show you again. So I'm just forming a little loop, pushing the thread, pulling it through. And now you can see we've got a pretty good knot there, enough that we don't really have to worry about this pulling through. Now I'm going to look at what I drew, and I drew a little bit of an angry eye on there, right? So what I'm going to do is match it up with what I've got here and just decide where I want his eye to be. And I think I'll even start with the eyebrow, right? Because that's kind of easier, a straight line. And what I'll do is I'll poke the needle up from the bottom, right? Because I don't want the knot to be showing on the outside. And you can see the knot has stopped it. So it's anchored right here, it's secure. And then my eyebrow was just a single angry line downwards. So all I'm going to do is pull this through, and voila, pretty simple, we've got our eyebrow. Now I want to give him his eye, right? Well, for the eye, I think what I'm going to do is just the same thing I did for the eyebrow, but over and over again. So I'm going to do these straight stitches across very close together, starting narrower at the top, getting wider, and then narrowing again, so that I've made kind of a little circle. Or I may make a semicircle, because then I think his eye will look a little angrier. So we're just going to go ahead and make it a little bit smaller than his eyebrow, right? And pull it on through. And then we'll come back out pretty much right underneath where we started, because we want these to be really close together. And I'll bring this closer and you can see I've got two little stitches there really close together. And I'm just going to keep going down until his eye is as big as I want it to be. And I'm coming out as close as possible to my previous stitch so that you don't see a gap and it's just one solid black eye. Okay, I actually really like how this eye looks, so I'm going to go ahead and leave it there. And then I want to go ahead and add his nostrils, right? And I added them as two little vertical lines right at the front of his nose. And that's a short distance, so I'm just going to hop straight on over to it. So let me mark out where I want his nostrils to be, and you can use chalk or pencil to do this, right? And then just stitch over your drawing. You don't have to do it freehand, but I'm going to do it freehand because I'm a little lazy and I don't like having to draw and erase. Okay, so you can see I went in and out and I just pulled down to have one little straight line there. That's his left nostril. Now let's give him his right nostril. So we're going to again poke from back to front, right? And I'm just going to do slightly lower down and smaller to show that it's further along on his nose. Pull it through. And we have got our snake's face, our dragon's face rather, but right now without wings I'd call him a snake. So what we need to do now is just go ahead and tie this off, right? So the way you tie off in embroidery, it's similar to the way you start, right? You needed to start with a knot so that it didn't slip out, and you need to finish with a knot so that it doesn't come undone. Now I'm going to come up close and show you, but the easiest way to do it, especially with those style of sewing we just did, is to turn the piece over so you're looking at the back, tuck your needle underneath the last stitch that you made, and then pull it through and tie a knot. So then you've got a knot made underneath that last stitch and it'll really secure it. So I'm going to come up close so that you can see this. So what we're going to do is just go ahead and poke this needle under our last stitch here. Sorry, I'm at kind of a weird angle. I'm going to pull it most of the way through, and then when it got most of the way through, see how I've left a little loop? There's a natural loop in here. We're just going to put the needle through it, pull tight, and there, it has auto knotted itself and we didn't have to worry about making a fancy knot and working it on down. So once you've knotted it, you can go ahead and make a second one if it doesn't look secure enough, but you can just snip it off. Okay, so we have got the face of our dragon done, and now we are ready to go ahead and pin him together and start stitching him all the way around. So first things first, I'm just going to line this back up again where I wanted it to be, and when I'm happy with that, I am going to take the straight pins and I'm going to just pin everything in place. Okay, now if you don't have straight pins, you don't have to do this part. It won't be a big deal. You just have to kind of be more careful as you're going around the edges to make sure everything's lined up. But if you do, all you'll need to do is just hold the fabric together with your fingers, poke that pin through, bring it on down, poke it through on the other side. So now you can see we've pinned this in place and it'll hold it together where we want those head spikes to be, right? And I'm just going to do this all the way around. I'm going to be very careful about a few places, and those places are the wings, right? Because I want to make sure I've got a pin straight through that so that it's on where I want them in his back. And then also the little tip of his tail, because it's so narrow down there, and I want to make sure that it ends up directly on top of each other, because it would look a little silly if it didn't. Okay, so we've got our second pin in, now our wings are pinned. Third pin, now we've got the base together, right? And I'll probably do one on his belly just to be safe. Okay, so now he's all pinned together, and I know he's lined up the way I want him to be, right? And if I'm happy with this, I can go ahead and I can start sewing around his edge. Now, one quick note before we start this, we need to make sure, since we're stuffing this, that we don't sew all the way around, right? Because if we don't leave a gap, we won't be able to put the stuffing in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to decide his belly looks like a good place for me to start stuffing him. So I'm just going to leave this section of him unstitched. I'll probably start right around the bottom of the tail. I'll stitch bottom of the tail up the back, all the way around his head, and then I'll stop, I'll stuff him, and I'll close it. Okay, so first things first, we have got to go ahead and thread our needle. Now, because his body is blue, I am going to use blue thread so that it stands out a little bit less, but you could use a really brightly colored one if you want to have the contrast, or you could stick with black, whatever suits you. And I'm going to go pretty long on this, the full length of my arm, right? I don't want to go much longer than that because it will start to get tangled and I'll have to pay a lot of attention to it. But I don't like going much shorter either because it's kind of a pain to have to tie off and start again. And I'm sure we will have to do that at least once, but this will reduce the number of times that happens. So once again, I'm using embroidery thread, so I'm just separating it into 2 strands of 3 little threads each. And I'm going to set one aside for if we run out of this and need to switch to a backup thread. And we're going to go ahead and thread the needle again the exact same way we did the first time. And I'll go ahead and use the needle threader, why not? Keep it simple. So we'll poke the threader through the eye of the needle, right? We will poke the thread through the threader, and then we'll pull it through. Now this is something I forgot to say before, but it is good if you haven't sewn before. You may have even noticed this. I always leave a little tail dangling. So we've got the longer body of the thread, right, that we're doing our sewing with, and then we've got this extra little tail hanging off. Now the reason we do this is that if you let it get really short or really close to the eye of the needle, then as you're sewing, as you're going along, you'll pull it out of the eye, and then you'll have to rethread it. And that's not the end of the world. It's not too difficult to do, but it is kind of a pain, right? So that's why we always leave this little bit of extra thread, this tail dangling, is just to make sure that if we yank a little too hard, it doesn't just pop right off the needle. So just like before, we're going to go ahead and tie our knot right at the very bottom. Here we go. And we are now ready to start sewing our dragon together. Now before I start sewing, I'm going to tell you there are 2 different kinds of stitches that I'm going to use to hold him together. One is called a running stitch. It's pretty much the same as what you saw me do on the eye, where you're doing a straight line. The only difference is instead of doing straight lines underneath each other, we're just going to do straight lines all the way along here. And we're using that to hold his wings and his spikes on. So for this section of him, we're going to do straight line stitches right here, and that'll hold all 3 layers together. For the rest of it, I'm going to do a really super simple stitch. It's called a whip stitch, and it is the easiest thing in the world. It is just going around the edge, you know, poking through and pulling through. And I'll be showing you all of these, but they're both pretty basic stitches, so don't be intimidated. We will definitely get through this sewing project together, right? Okay, we are ready to start sewing. We're starting here at the tip of the tail. I have my thread, it's knotted at the end, and the very first thing I'm going to do is poke through, pull through, tuck my little tail under. Now you'll notice that I went ahead and I pulled through from the inside of the body, right? So that the knot is hidden on the inside. So it's the same thing we did when we were sewing his face on. We want to hide the knot on the inside so that no one can see it. Now once you've got it on there, hold these two pieces so that they're lined up with each other, and we're going to start our whip stitch. And like I said, it's pretty simple. You can see we've got these two pieces. You're just going to poke up from the opposite side and pull through. And you can see it creates a little horizontal stitch there. Pretty simple, and we're just going to do the same thing further up the tail. So again, we're going to go around to the other side, poke, pull. Excuse me, I almost got the thread caught on the dragon there. Don't do that. And now we've got two of these little stitches next to each other, right? So it's pretty straightforward. You're just going to keep going around, poking from back to front, pulling it through, and you will get these simple stitches. Now don't make them too far apart because the stuffing will leak out, right? So they don't need to be like within 1 millimeter of each other, but you know, make sure they're close enough that you won't be leaking stuffing everywhere or whatever you're using to hold it together. And we're just going to go ahead and go all the way around the outside of the body. And I will check back in with you once we hit the base of the wings because we'll start switching to that running stitch. Alright, so I have stitched up the bottom and the back, and now I'm ready to go ahead and switch to a running stitch. So no need to change anything about our thread or our needle. All we need to do is poke up from the bottom to the top, pull all the way through, and now instead of going around the edge, you're just going to poke down from the top to the bottom and pull all the way through. I am varying the size of my stitch only because I want to make sure I'm spearing the wings, right? So just make sure that your stitch goes through the wings to hold it on. If you're worried about the wings falling out, you can do what I'm about to do, which is stitching backwards as well. I'm just going to go back and forth over these wings, really just secure them on there, because they're pretty thin, right? They're a pretty thin piece of fabric, and I don't want them to slip out. So I went back and forth over the same spot a couple of times. If your wings are fatter than mine, or if you put them further in here, you probably don't need to do that. But I just want to be careful. And now I'm just going to resume my normal running stitch, sorry. So I'm going to go from the bottom to the top, pull through, poke down from the top to the bottom this time. Let me bring it up so you can see. Pull through, and we've got that straight stitch, right? And then just do the same thing for the top. From the bottom to the top, top to the bottom, going straight along. And right now I'm sewing on our spikes, right? Now, again, like with the whip stitch, it doesn't matter too much how big your stitches are. Just make sure they're not so big that, again, you're going to have stuffing leaking out, right? And you probably don't want to make them so small that it takes you 2 hours to finish an inch, right? So just try to find that happy medium. I'm doing mine about this size. I'll hold it up close so you can see. Just going in and out and making sure I've got my spikes held in place by this. Oh, we have just enough, I think, thread to finish this side, and then I will show you guys how to tie off and start with new thread. Okay, so I have finished all of my running stitches. I also had the idea of sewing a little forked tongue in there, which I got a kick out of, so you can borrow that idea if you'd like. Or I think flames would also be a fun thing to have coming out of his mouth. And I'm pretty much at the end of my thread, so I'm going to go ahead and tie this off, and I'll show you. All we need to do is open it up a little, go under the last stitch, like so, And then just like before, right, we've got this loop. Poke your needle through that loop, pull, and it'll tie its own little knot. I'm going to do a second one just to be safe. And now I'm just going to snip this off. And we will go ahead and rethread. So this time I'm going to rethread just without using the threader, and I'll show you that again. So we'll wet the thread again. You can use water for this, you don't have to spit on it. Flatten it against the back of your thumbnail, and then just poke it through the eye of the needle and pull it on through. And then once again we'll tie that little knot right at the end of the strand. Pull it on through the loop here. And then we'll do that one more time just to be extra safe. Make sure it doesn't pull through. And I'll snip off the excess. And then I'm going to get started. So I finish right below the tongue, right? So I'm going to poke back in. Again, you're poking the needle between the two layers of cloth so that the knot is hidden inside, right? Other than that, pretty straightforward, and I'm going to make sure that I poked my tail down inside because I don't want this tail of thread hanging out, though if you were using red thread it could look like a tongue or flame. And then we'll just do the same thing we did before, which is back to front, little whip stitches all the way around, right? So just go ahead and get started on that. And remember, we are leaving his belly open. So do not close his belly. And I will check back in with you once we have everything except for the belly stitched. Alright, we're back. So I've sewn everything except the belly. I'm going to pull out these last pins because I don't need them anymore. And now it is time to start stuffing. Now, if you have that pen or pencil from when we were sketching our dragon earlier, this is actually really helpful. You can see he's got a lot of narrow parts, and we're going to be able to use this to poke the fluff down into the different parts of his body. So, I've got my bag of polyfill. You can be using whatever you've got on hand, fabric, paper, you name it, and you just go ahead and stuff it straight into his little stomach. And then poke it down either with your fingers or with that pencil, and you can see I'm starting to fill up his head. Now the tough thing with filling is it's really easy to overfill and make it burst, but you also want to make sure that you have enough that it's nice and fluffy, right, and it's not just a flat piece of felt, although that can be nice too. So I'm just going to start stuffing until I feel like I'm pretty happy with how his head looks, and now I'm going to start filling in his tail, and I'll do his midsection last, because that's the last part we're going to sew up, right? So I'm just going to keep poking this in. And try and get this down into his little tail. That's where this pen or pencil can be useful. Okay, so I have finished stuffing my little friend here, and I'm pretty happy with how much stuffing he has in him. This is totally up to you what size you want it to be, but once you're done, knot the end of your thread again and get ready to stitch up your dragon. So I'm going to go again from the inside to the outside right to hide the knot, tuck that little tail of thread, and then for this I'm really going to squeeze it together, and we're just going to do that same we're going to do that same whip stitch that we were doing before. Make sure that you're pulling nice and tight. So that none of this stuffing leaks out. And if you're starting to sew and you think, you know what, I put way too much stuffing in here, there's no way to hold, don't worry about it. You're at the perfect time to either rip out your last few stitches or just reach in there and pull out that extra fluff. And I'm gonna finish closing him and probably even go a few extra stitches down just to be extra sure that I have closed him. still. And now it's time to tie off. So we've got our fully sewn dragon all the way around, and all we're going to do is go underneath the last stitch here with our needle, pull through so we've got that little loop, and just the same as before, we're going to make a knot. Oh, and we're not going to catch his tail in it the way that I just did. And now we can see we've got a nice little knot. I'm going to trim it as close as humanly possible. Ha ha! And there you go, a stuffed dragon. Now you can add a bunch more detailing on this, on his wings, on his body. I'd originally cut a second ridge of spikes for his tail, but I didn't really like the way it looked. So play around with what you'd like to add to him and how you'd like him to look. But that is the basic process for making your own little stuffed animal. Thanks for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the video today and that you learned a little bit about hand sewing. If you want to see more videos like this, you can check our feed.